Picture this. The year is 1939. Europe is months away from the deadliest war in human history. Cities will burn. Millions will die. The entire world is about to change forever. And at that exact moment, 5 men in SS uniforms are sitting on top of the world deep in the heart of the Himalayas, measuring the faces of Tibetan monks. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a Hollywood screenplay. This is documented history. Why did the most brutal, militaristic regime of the 20th century send a scientific expedition to the most isolated place on Earth? What were they really looking for? And what did they find? The answer is far more disturbing than any conspiracy theory. It reveals how an ideology can hijack science, how a government can twist history to build a myth, and just how far human beings are willing to go when they genuinely believe in their own fantasy. This is the story of the Nazi expedition to Tibet and its stranger. More real and more terrifying than you think. To understand the expedition, you need to understand the man who ordered it. It wasn't Hitler. It was Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was the head of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, the Nazi Party's elite paramilitary organization. But calling him just a bureaucrat of terror would be a massive oversimplification. Himmler was simultaneously one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany and one of the most consumed by mysticism, occultism, and the hunt for lost racial origins. From a young age, Himmler kept a diary filled with notes on ancient history, Germanic symbolism, and esoteric philosophy. He devoured books on lost civilizations, on Atlantis, on the theory that a race of superior beings had once given rise to modern humanity and that Germans were their direct descendants. This obsession wasn't a private hobby for Himmler. It was a historical mission. He believed that for the Third Reich to claim its rightful place in the world, military power alone wasn't enough. It needed a historical narrative, an origin story, a founding myth that could justify the supposed supremacy of the Aryan race. And if that narrative needed to be invented, fabricated, or distorted, so be it. What mattered was that it existed. That belief is what drove him to create. In 1935, the Ahnenerbe, the full name was Ahnenerbe Studiengesellschaft, Vergeistesgesellschaft, roughly translated as the Society for Research into the Spiritual Roots of Germany's Ancestral Heritage, a long academic sounding name for what was, in practice, a pseudoscience machine in service of propaganda. Officially, the Ahnenerbe was a research institute. It had departments for archaeology, linguistics, anthropology, the history of religion, even astronomy. It published journals, funded expeditions, and hired respected academics. But there was one non-negotiable condition attached to every research project. The results had to confirm Aryan superiority. That wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive. If the evidence didn't point in the right direction, it was ignored, reinterpreted, or thrown out entirely over the course of its existence. The Ahnenerbe sponsored dozens of expeditions around the world. Teams went to Scandinavia searching for ancient ruins, to Greece to claim Germanic origins for classical civilization, to the Middle East looking for connections to Semitic cultures specifically to prove that Aryans had dominated them, and to Tibet. Because for Himmler, Tibet wasn't just a remote corner of Asia, it was the possible cradle of a lost civilization, the place where the ancestors of the Aryans had once lived, for spreading across the world and seeding the great civilizations of antiquity. Does that sound absurd? It does. But this idea didn't come out of nowhere. To understand why Tibet, you have to travel back a few centuries in the 19th century. Comparative linguistics uncovered something genuinely remarkable. There existed an ancient language family called Proto-Indo-European that was the common ancestor of Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, Persian, German, and dozens of other languages. This suggested that vastly different peoples, Europeans, Persians, South Asians, shared a distant, common cultural and linguistic origin. Linguists called that hypothetical ancestral culture Aryan. Up to that point, legitimate science. The problem began when 19th century thinkers Many of them Europeans with political and racial agendas started transforming that linguistic hypothesis into a racial theory. They claimed that Aryans weren't just a cultural group, but a biologically superior race. More intelligent, more creative, more fit to rule, and that Germans were their rightful heirs. These ideas were amplified by figures like Count Gobino and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and eventually absorbed into the entire ideological machinery of Nazism. What had been a linguist's working hypothesis became state doctrine. The swastika, ancient symbol found in cultures across India, Tibet, Japan, ancient Greece, and even pre-Columbian America, was held up as the visual proof of this theory. If the same symbol appeared across such wildly different cultures, it meant, to the Nazis, that all of them had been founded or influenced by the same Aryan ancestors. It was in this context that Tibet earned a special place in the imagination of the Third Reich, a remote region, spiritually intense, home to millennial traditions, barely documented by the Western world. For Himmler, it was the perfect place to find or manufacture the proof he needed. Every mission needs a leader, someone with real scientific credentials, hands-on experience in Asian terrain, capable of lending academic legitimacy to the project. That man was Ernst Schaefer, born in 1910, Cologne. Schaefer was a brilliant zoologist and a born explorer. Before he turned 30, he'd already taken part in 2 expeditions to Tibet. One in 1931 and another in 1934, both led by American ornithologist Brooke Dolan. He knew the territory, spoke local dialects, and had established contacts throughout the region. Schaefer was also a member of the SS, something that, in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, was practically unavoidable for anyone who wanted government funding for research. But historians still debate whether he was a true ideological believer or simply a pragmatic opportunist, who worked the system to do what he loved, explore. Whatever his personal motivations, when Himmler presented the concept of a third Tibet expedition, this time under the Ahnenerbe's banner, Schaefer agreed. The team was assembled carefully. Bruno Beger, the expedition's anthropologist, a specialist in racial anthropology. Beger was responsible for collecting physical measurements from Tibetans, measuring, recording, comparing later in the war. Beger would be involved in far darker crimes, including the selection of Auschwitz prisoners for a skeleton collection. He was tried for war crimes in 1971. Karl Weinert, geophysicist and surveyor, responsible for magnetic and geographic mapping of the region. Ernst Krauss, entomologist and cinematographer, tasked with documenting the wildlife and filming the expedition. Edmund Gear, the team's technician and logistics coordinator. 5 men, 1 mission, and an objective that blended real science with ideological fantasy. In April 1938, the expedition left Germany. The journey to Tibet was an odyssey in itself. There were no direct flights, no roads to speak of. The team traveled by ship to India, then under British rule, and the British were not exactly thrilled about. Nazi scientists roaming their colony on the eve of a war. The British government initially denied them passage. It took weeks of diplomatic back and forth before the expedition received authorization to transit through India. Tibet itself posed a separate challenge. At the time, Tibet was governed by the young 14th Dalai Lama, who was only about 2 or 3 years old and in practice by a regency council of lamas and nobles. The country was politically isolated and deeply suspicious of foreign influence, especially after decades of pressure from both Britain and China. How did the Germans get access? Partly through Schaefer's diplomatic skill, partly through carefully crafted letters of introduction, and partly because the Tibetan Regency saw a connection with Nazi Germany as a potential counterweight to British and Chinese influence. The expedition crossed into Tibet in January 1939 and reached Lhasa the same month, an extraordinary achievement given the political and geographic barriers standing in their way. In Lhasa, they were received with measured hospitality. They visited the Potala Palace. They attended religious ceremonies. They photographed and filmed Tibetan daily life extensively, and of course, they measured. This is where the expedition enters its most disturbing territory. Bruno Beger, the team's anthropologist, had a specific assignment: collect biometric data from Tibetans and compare it to the racial measurements the Nazis believed represented the ideal Aryan human in practical terms. That meant measuring skull length and width, calculating the cephalic index, a pseudometric widely used in 19th century racial anthropology that claimed to determine intelligence and racial origin based on skull shape, measuring the facial angle, the slope of the forehead relative to the jaw. Another pseudoscientific method supposedly capable of revealing degrees of racial evolution, according eye color, the spacing between eyes, nose shape, hair texture, making plaster casts of faces and hands too. Preserve the physical forms as racial specimens. For later study back in Germany, Beger conducted these measurements on more than 300 Tibetans. What was he looking for? Any sign that Tibetans carried Aryan traits? Any feature that could be interpreted as a link between the Himalayan population and the mythical ancestors of the German people? The Tibetans, who submitted to these measurements almost certainly had no idea of the ideological weight behind them. For most, it was probably just a strange curiosity. Pale foreigners, with metal instruments asking questions and scribbling notes. For Beger and Himmler, it was the search for the origin of the world. There's one dimension of the expedition that's harder to document precisely because it exists on the borderline between history and legend. The Nazi interest in Tibet wasn't purely racial. It was also deeply mystical. Himmler was captivated by European esoteric traditions, especially those of the 19th century Victorian occultism, Helena Blavatsky's theosophy, and German secret societies like the Thule and Vril groups. Theosophy, in particular, had a peculiar grip on Nazi thinking. Blavatsky had popularized in the late 1800s the idea that humanity had passed through successive root races, lost civilizations that had existed before the known ones, like Lemuria and Atlantis, and that the current race, the fifth root race, was the Aryan. This pseudoscientific, spiritualist theory was absorbed and weaponized by the Nazis as evidence of their superiority, and at the heart of these theories was Tibet, the region where, according to various Western esoteric traditions of the 19th century, a connection to lost civilizations supposedly existed, where hidden sages guarded forbidden knowledge, where the legendary kingdom of Shambhala, the pure land of Tibetan Buddhist tradition, might be, to certain occult-obsessed Westerners, a physical and reachable place. The expedition made inquiries into local legends about Shambhala and hidden kingdoms. There's no evidence that the team members literally expected to find a hidden city. But the symbolic dimension was real. They were seeking mythological validation for the Nazi worldview, and the most powerful symbol of that search was everywhere they looked: the swastika in Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. The swastika, called Yungdrung in the Bon tradition, or simply swastika in Buddhism, appeared in murals, fabrics, and carved woodwork. To Tibetans, it was a symbol of eternity, good fortune, and spiritual well-being, with thousands of years of history behind it. To Himmler, it was the proof he'd been searching for. The same mark, 2 continents apart, separated by millennia. To him, that wasn't a coincidence. That was heritage. Over months in Tibet, the expedition assembled a remarkable archive: biometric records, Beger's measurements of more than 300 individuals, including standardized front-hand profile photographs, plaster casts, and extensive written notes. Cinematic documentation. Ernst Krause filmed extensively religious rituals, ceremonies, landscapes, daily life in Lhasa, traditional festivals, monks in prayer. This footage became a documentary called J. Himnesfol's Tibet, Mysterious Tibet, released in Germany in 1943. Zoological specimens, true to the expedition's scientific cover. Schaefer collected hundreds of animal specimens, birds, mammals, insects, many of them new to Western science. This portion of the work was genuinely scientific and produced legitimate contributions to zoology. Manuscripts. The team acquired through purchase and as gifts from Tibetan authorities dozens of Buddhist and Bon manuscripts, including ritual and astronomical texts, religious artifacts and objects, statues, ceremonial tools, textiles, musical instruments. Some were sent to Germany as diplomatic gifts. Others were purchased outright. Geophysical records. Wienert conducted magnetic surveys of the region. Data that held legitimate scientific value, entirely independent of any ideological agenda. In total, the expedition returned to Germany with dozens of crates of material. It was the largest collection of data on Tibet ever assembled by a Western mission up to that point. The problem is what happened next. The expedition left Tibet in August 1939. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The world went to war. The expedition's material was incorporated into the Ahnenerbe's archives in Berlin. Himmler was pleased with the results and considered the project a success, at least from a propaganda standpoint. There were plans for follow-up expeditions, 4 major publications based on the collected data. None of it happened. The war consumed everything. The Ahnenerbe's resources were progressively redirected toward other projects, some scientific, others horrifying, including medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners, in which institute members were directly involved. Schaefer continued working for the Ahnenerbe during the war, but never returned to Tibet. After the war ended, he was captured by Allied forces, interrogated, and eventually released. He emigrated to Venezuela, worked as a researcher for several years, then returned to Germany, where he lived until 1992. Bruno Beger met a darker legal fate. In 1971, he was tried for his involvement in the selection of Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz for a skeleton collection intended for the University of Strasbourg, one of the most macabre projects the Ahnenerbe ever undertook. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years of semi-open imprisonment, a ruling widely condemned as grotesquely lenient. The expedition's archives suffered varied fates. Some were destroyed in Allied bombing raids on Berlin. Some were scattered in the chaos of the war's end. Others survived and were distributed among various German institutions, museums, university archives, private collections to this day. Researchers are still working to fully catalog and contextualize the material. After the fall of the Third Reich, the Tibet expedition became fuel for decades of speculation. The myths multiplied fast. Some claimed the Nazis had established secret bases in the Himalayas. Others suggested Himmler had sent emissaries to learn martial arts and supernatural powers from Tibetan masters. Some versions claimed Nazi survivors had fled to Tibet after 1945, hiding in remote monasteries. Entire books have been built on these narratives. TV documentaries, video games, action movies. The connection between Nazis and Asian occultism became one of entertainment culture's favorite recurring themes. None of these stories have solid historical backing. There's an almost perfect irony in that. The Third Reich was destroyed, but the myths it helped create kept circulating now in the form of entertainment rather than propaganda. The difference is that today people consume these stories as fun fiction. In Germany, in 1938, they were presented as scientific truth. Strip away the myths and look at what's documented, and what you find is far more unsettling than any conspiracy. The Tibet expedition was real. The team actually went to Tibet, actually measured real people, actually collected real material, and actually came back with real data. And all of it was placed in service of a lie, not a crude or improvised lie. An elaborate academic, methodical lie. A lie that used the scientific method, precision instruments, data collection, systematic documentation. To construct a racial fantasy, that's what makes the Ahnenerbe and the Tibet expedition so profoundly disturbing to historians of science. As a method is neutral, it can be used to cure disease or to build weapons. To understand human nature or to manufacture justifications for genocide, The Third Reich demonstrated with terrifying clarity that methodological rigor is no protection against the perversion of knowledge, that academics with advanced degrees, well-equipped laboratories, and peer-reviewed publications can be entirely in service of evil if they choose to be. Bruno Beger measured 300 Tibetans with millimeter precision, and a few years later selected human beings to be turned into skeletal specimens. The same hands, the same instruments, the same meticulous attention to detail. This isn't an isolated historical aberration. It's a warning today. Expedition's material is scattered across various institutions in Germany. The photographs, thousands of them, are valuable historical documents about Tibet in 1939. A society that would undergo profound transformation just years later, when China occupied the country in 1950. Ernst Krauss's films preserve images of rituals, ceremonies, and landscapes that would otherwise have been lost to history entirely. There's a painful irony in that. The material collected by a Nazi expedition has become, over time, a legitimate historical archive of pre-modern Tibet. Tibetan scholars and Buddhist studies researchers and historians consult these images to understand what that society looked like before the upheavals of the 20th century. Tibet that Schaefer and his team documented no longer exists. Monasteries were destroyed. Traditions were suppressed. Generations were lost. And paradoxically, the cameras of Nazi Germans are among the richest witnesses to that vanished world. History has this disturbing ability to produce ironies that no fiction writer would dare invent. You might be wondering, why does any of this matter now? Because the mechanisms that made the Tibet expedition possible didn't disappear with the Third Reich. The human capacity to build ideological narratives and disguise them as science is permanent. The tendency to seek confirmation of pre-existing beliefs, rather than following evidence wherever it leads, is a feature of human psychology, not a Nazi peculiarity. Governments still fund research that confirms their policies. Institutions still produce data that serve specific interests. Academics still lend their credentials to projects with hidden agendas. The scale has changed. The technology has changed. The objectives have changed, but the pattern persists, and the antidote isn't to distrust all science. It's to understand how science works, recognize its vulnerabilities, and maintain the critical capacity to ask, who's funding this? What outcome was expected? What was left out? The Tibet expedition ended more than 80 years ago. The Himalayas remain unmoved. Those mountains watched. Nazi scientists arrived with measuring instruments and watched them leave without the answers they came for. In the end, what they found in Tibet was what we always find when we search for confirmation instead of truth. Nothing but a reflection of what we already believed. The Tibet expedition didn't give the Third Reich the proof it was looking for. The Himalayas revealed no Aryan homeland. No secret manuscript confirmed German racial superiority. No hidden bloodline connected the monks of Lhasa to the medieval Germanic warriors, because that proof didn't exist. It never did, and deep down, Himmler probably knew that. But the project was never about finding the truth. It was about building a narrative, about producing images, data, and reports that could be presented to the German people as evidence that the Reich was backed by history, by science, and by destiny. It was propaganda wearing the costume of a scientific expedition, and it worked for as long as the regime lasted. That's what makes this chapter of history so chillingly relevant. Today, not the Nazis specifically, not Tibet, not the skull measurements, but the idea that a powerful narrative, well-documented, confidently delivered, and repeated with enough conviction, can replace the truth in the minds, millions. That danger didn't die in 1945. It lives wherever ideology is placed above evidence, wherever the desire to confirm overpowers the commitment to discover, wherever myth is more convenient than facts, and that's why. 80 years later, the Nazi expedition to Tibet still deserves to be remembered, not as entertainment, not as mystery, as a warning. Enjoyed this. Share it with someone who loves history that actually makes you think. And if you want to keep exploring the darkest and most fascinating chapters of the 20th century, stick around.